Republican racket released a bombshell report last week that top scientists allegedly misled Congress about COVID origins. According to newly released emails and messages, the messages between Christian Anderson and his colleagues reportedly spanned the period during which they collaborated in writing Proximal Origin. According to the public, the messages show that Anderson and his colleagues thought it was possible, quote, not only that the virus that causes COVID-19 had leaked from the Wuhan Institute of Virology, but specifically that it had been cultured in a laboratory. This view is different than what Anderson and Dr. Robert Gary, two advisors to Dr. Anthony Fauci, said in their testimony to the House Select Subcommittee on the Coronavirus Pandemic last week.
Now evidence suggests that Fauci himself was behind COVID origins disinformation. According to Public, reports that in 2020, Fauci upheld the Proximal Origin paper as, quote, definitive scientific research. Joining us now to weigh in on all of this and how the investigation into COVID-19's origins might be impacting the public's trust in science is journalist Matt Taibbi. Matt, we are thrilled to have you back. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on, Robbie.
And we were just talking about this New York Times piece, which came out earlier today, this very, very, very long, neutral on its face sort of seeming evaluation of the different possibilities, lab leak, lab leak, deliberate bioweapon, and natural spillover, where it's a very long article, and then at the end, the author kind of reveals their biases and starts to dig into, continue to push the animal spillover theory. The raccoon dogs, who I thought had been acquitted by now, come in for, to be additionally suspected again. What do you make of how this dialogue continues to unfold with so many interested parties still seeming to go, but animals spill over?
Yeah, it's really kind of an amazing article, isn't it, Rick? Because at the end, they dig into Frankenstein and tests of the D'Urbervilles and the JFK assassination. Basically, they're implying that all the reporting that we put out last week was speculative conspiracy theory, when actually all we were doing was just revealing that what the scientists at the time actually thought, which was that it was not only possible, but, quote, so friggin' likely,
right.
According to Anderson. And, that's not conspiracy theory. That's not something that's picked out of the air. That's, concretely what they were thinking at the time. And moreover, the Times actually kind of debunked a lot of the points that they went over in their own article with prior reporting earlier this year, especially at the end of April. So it's a very strange thing. It's like a lot of media stories. They just keep digging.
Yeah, and absolutely. And I think what was so helpful in your disclosures and Michael Schellenberger's work on proximal origins is not only that they were very concerned it could have been a lab leak, and then we're looking, well, what changes their mind? But also in there, it's clear that they think the truth will not actually come out, and that it would be better for scientists, for scientific advisors, for research funding, if it was not a lab leak. And those two things are very evident in the messages that you have helped discover. And I think thus, it gives an answer to the question of, well, what causes them then to weigh so heavily on animal spillover? Well, it's because they thought they would get away with that explanation and it would be much better for them.
Well, that's what's so interesting about these communications, and you're right. They explicitly say, there's one line in there where one of the scientists, I'm forgetting whether it's Rambo or Gary, or actually it might have been Holmes, who said the truth will never come out if lab origin or if lab escape is the truth. You couldn't put it more directly than that. But then there's this constellation of emails and communications between Nature magazine and the health officials, sort of one of the largest funders, Jeremy Farrar from Wellcome Trust, then Fauci and Francis Collins, and it's abundantly clear that they want the paper to say basically that there's no possibility of lab origin. And the scientists, you can see them over time moving towards accepting that position. They were rejected initially when they, by Nature, because the paper was not enough in that direction, and they eventually made that change. So that's what's so interesting about these documents, and it shows how strongly they felt they couldn't exclude this possibility.
This document, or rather documents, you say, if you read them like a novel from what's been released by the public, you have these exchanges between the four scientists, and you also say in your piece in Racket News that they might not necessarily be evil. How do we move forward from this, understanding that from the research perspective, they might not want people to know that this was a lab leak because that might mean less funding for research. They find their research very important. Of course, it's kind of a disgustingly paternalistic approach to assume the public can't handle the idea that it was a lab leak. But how do we move forward from this and have some kind of, laws passed for better research protocols when it comes to matters of public health? Can we? Because you say also in your piece that it's kind of like walking in on a spouse cheating. Now that people know how this research was released, it's hard to go back from that, and it's kind of destroyed institutional trust. How do you see we move forward productively?
Yeah, and this is a point that Dr. Jay Bhattacharya made when I talked to him. How does science recover from this? How do you regain trust? And it's similar to what happens in journalism. After an episode like, for instance, the WMD affair or even Russiagate, I would argue, once the public is betrayed and they see that they've been betrayed, it's very hard to win that trust back. And in science, it's the same thing. You affirmatively have a mission to ignore things like political considerations in science. You have to just follow what the science says. And what you see in these communications is that they not only did that, but they did it consciously, and they talk about doing it. They say things like, "I hate it when political considerations enter science, but in this case, it's unavoidable." The public is going to see that, and they're now going to think every time there's some quote-unquote consensus among scientists that perhaps the conclusion has been politicized, and there's no way to regain that trust. I think you both agree. It's just like journalism. It's organic. You can only do it over a period of time when you prove to be trustworthy again and again and again, and they've really undermined quite a lot, I think, in this episode.
Yeah, in this long New York Times piece, they note that if you poll people on what they think is the more likely way that COVID came to be, that it's not even close. Most people, Republicans, Democrats, ordinary people are inclined toward the lab leak theory at this point decisively. We know that the scientists who looked at this initially, privately, were pretty mixed and pretty fearful of the lab leak scenario. We know that the FBI and the Energy Department have concluded the lab leak is more likely. There's all these people who think lab leak is just as plausible, if not more likely. Like the last category of people to come around to this way of thinking is, in fact, the mainstream media that so confidently asserted not just that the lab leak was wrong, but that it was racist and conspiratorial to think that. On the basis of listening to scientists, we now have so many examples. The Hunter Biden laptop story being another one of the experts saying injecting into the atmosphere a conclusion that I think is too strong, and then the media taking that and making an even stronger claim than the one the experts made, and then doubling and tripling and quadrupling down on that because why do they do that? Because they would look foolish if they had to admit that they did their own misinformation even from the perspective of the experts they were relying on.
I don't understand why they do that, but you're absolutely right, Robbie. That's like a new phenomenon in media where somebody will put out a story that says X, and on the very day of that story, you immediately get all these headlines that are X plus 1, X plus 2, X plus 3,
yes.
right?
Yes.
So, for instance, you talk about the Hunter Biden story. When the 50 intelligence officers put out that letter, what they said was, this has all the earmarks of a classic Russian information operation. And right away, Politico has a headline that says, intelligence officers say, laptop story is Russian disinfo, right? So they go from information to disinformation in the headline, and that happened in this case too. The proximal origin paper really only said that we think laboratory origin is improbable, but right away you had headlines saying this was natural origin and lab leak was excluded. basically using this as the source. And this became basically an article of faith among both politicians and members of the media. And it's this kind of thing that it's a snowballing phenomenon that we see over and over again in the press. And I'd be curious to hear what you think, because I think it's a new thing in the media, isn't it?
It is a new thing. I mean, my theory is that the expert class, scientists, intelligence officers, even like federal law enforcement, are now just kind of part of the same team as the mainstream media. These are the experts that are relied upon. If you watch CNN and MSNBC, it's all prosecutors, it's all former State Department officials, it's all Sanjay Gupta type people who are part of the expert class. So there's a lot more skepticism on there's just like wild skepticism of everything on like the Republican side. Even skepticism that goes like beyond the natural skepticism I even have. But on the Democratic and mainstream and establishment side, it's just trust. It's trust in what the experts say, and some kind of, which is intention. Yeah. So I turn this back to you, as someone who has been in the media for a long time, and doing great reporting and debunking things that were believed to be true by experts in media, et cetera. There's more belief, and there's more like, well, if you're going to question things, you should like be a Republican or something.
Yeah, it's very strange, because I always thought one of the cool things about being a reporter was that you didn't have to come to a conclusion. You put out the stuff that you have. If you only have a certain amount of information, if it only gets you so far, but not all the way to an absolute conclusion, whatever, you're doing your job honestly, you put it out there, you go to sleep, you wake up the next morning, and maybe you find something different the next day. I think a lot of people in the profession now feel pressure immediately to come to a conclusion that satisfies one or the other political directions of the moment. And so they feel an obligation to get 100% to the end of a question when they do every story. But that's not the way journalism works, not even in this story that we did. I mean, we're not proving that it came out of a lab. All these documents show is that there was significant apprehension at the very beginning of the story, which I think is very interesting. It's not conclusive, but that's sort of how journalism works. And it's also, by the way, how science is supposed to work. And this pressure that we're seeing to come to absolute whole conclusions, I think is very dangerous, and also makes the job very unpleasant on top of everything else.
Yeah, I'm curious what you make, just really quick, last question, of the timing of the changing narrative, where for so long it was, most likely from animal origins, and then it was in this same, I think, span of a week that we were discussing the banning of TikTok and the Chinese spy balloon, and then also, hey, guess what? Maybe it was a lab leak. To me, that sounds like this kind of manufacturing consent. Let's be mad at China this week so we can get this substantive piece of legislation passed that would give Congress a lot of control around freedom on the internet. What do you make of that larger picture and that narrative?
That's interesting. I hadn't thought about that. I have thought about the fact that I don't think a lot of these stories would have come out had there not been some consensus in some parts of the intelligence community that we want this stuff to come out. Some of the stories that we did at Public and Racket, involving, for instance, the names of the people who were reported to have been sick at the Wuhan lab in November of 2019, and also the fact that the Department of Energy and the FBI came around to a conclusion that lab leak was probable or likely. This story probably doesn't happen if there was not that conclusion internally, and there was not some internal institutional momentum towards putting this out there. Why is that? Why do they want to do that now? I don't know. That's a good question. I think it needs to be answered, though.
And just real quickly before we let you go, I have to ask this because, you were grilled in front of Congress by, Democratic members when you testified on the Twitter files, and Delegate Stacey Plaskett was, particularly strident with you. I think she threatened to put you in jail for perjury. She was equally strident with RFK Jr. when he testified on kind of, some similar issues, how the federal government might have pushed social social media companies to censor, and they tried to prevent the entire hearing from taking place. And they said Stacey Plaskett came as close as you possibly can. I read her comments very closely to explicitly saying that misinformation should not be protected by the First Amendment. Can you comment on our Democratic representatives' transformation on this free speech subject with respect to you and RFK Jr. and others who are talking about these issues?
Sure. First of all, I thought the optics of that hearing were unbelievable. I was expecting something weird. Obviously, I had been in front of that same committee, and even in the middle of it, I was sort of amazed at how crazy it got. But the decision by the Democrats to try to move the entire hearing into executive session, when the hearing was about censorship, I mean, a comedy writer couldn't script that. That would be a difficult thing to come up with, I think, without a little bit of inspiration. And I don't think they see the optics of that. I think they think that this looks good on video, whereas in fact, I think it looks crazy, and it makes RFK look like the calm, normal person that you would that can relate to ordinary people. But what you mentioned with Representative Plaskett, she said essentially that this is not the kind of the protected speech that I know. I forget the exact phrasing of her quote, but it read like, I don't think she really knows what the First Amendment is and why it exists and why we protect speech that we ourselves don't agree with or find offensive. This is a core part of the American tradition, and it seems alien to this new cast of Democrats. And I don't really understand it, because there was always that person in the Democratic caucus who was a real believer in these issues, and it's strange to see it just disappear that way.
Strange and sad. Matt Taibbi, thank you so much for being with us.
Oh, thanks for having me on.